On August 16th at 7:15 a.m. here in Mooresburg, Tennessee, a Piper J3 Cub aircraft with the registration number November 21811 crashed, killing the pilot. That pilot was racing legend Scott Bloomquist, also known as Bloomer, is decidedly known as the GOAT of late model dirt racing. Welcome to another tour. Today we are finding the location and discussing the crash that killed Scott Bloomquist, a name synonymous with dirt track racing. He embodied the essence of persistence and ingenuity. His path from humble beginnings to becoming a living legend in the motorsports is filled with moments of triumph and challenges. Today's tour explores the life and legacy of Scott Bloomquist, tracing the twists and turns that shaped his incredible journey. Today, we are at a small private airstrip owned and used by Cloud9 Concrete, located here in Bean Station, Tennessee, which is right on the border with Mooresburg, Tennessee. We are flying the Cabri G2, which is a modern, lightweight two-seat helicopter which has a cruise speed of approximately 185 kilometers an hour or 115 miles per hour, and a range of about 700 kilometers or 435 miles. Let's get the helicopter started. We will get off the ground here shortly and we will talk about Scott and what happened here in Tennessee. We will be flying from here at this small airstrip to Scott's property where he and his parents lived. It's where they had his business, both of their houses, an airstrip, and a couple aircraft hangars. Scott Dean Bloomquist was born in Fort Dodge, Iowa in 1963, where both his parents had lived and gone to school together, and his grandparents were farmers. Scott wasn't raised in a stereotypical racing family. There was no dynasties or garages filled with race trophies in his childhood. From Iowa, his family moved to Southern California when his father, who was an electrician, decided to pursue a career as a pilot. His father would indeed go on to be a successful pilot, not a race car driver, although his dad was an excellent mechanic and a fabricator who built cars and airplanes in his spare time. Moving to California, he would be far from the heartland of dirt tracks that Scott would later dominate. But it was here, amid the surf culture and sun-soaked streets, that young Scott first developed a taste for speed, adrenaline, and at times, trouble.
And the three-time winner to his 25th World 100 in the Old Smoky Moonshine Sweet Bloomquist number 0 out of Mooresburg, Tennessee. How about it? Let's hear it for Scott Bloomquist.
While Scott was still a teenager in Corona, California, his father bought his own race car after seeing a fellow pilot race one on a dirt track nearby. The car was actually an asphalt race car that had been converted for dirt tracks. His father made one race and knew right away he wanted no part of it, so he decided to let Scott drive it if he wanted to, otherwise he was selling it. So starting the next week, Scott drove the car. As Scott tells the story, his dad did not have an air tank for the tires, so he intentionally overinflated the tires to make sure he had enough pressure when he got to the track. But he then forgot to let some of the air pressure out before the race started. With the tires overinflated, Scott says he was slipping and sliding to the point where he hit everything but the concession stand that night. They soon figured out what the problem was, and Scott was on his way to winning. Scott would continue to drive the car the rest of that season. In one of the last races of that season, Scott got spun out and another car hit him head-on, destroying the car. Not ones to give up at that point, Scott and his dad then asked Dillon Chassis to build a tubular frame for dirt racing. They did, and that was the car that he won his first race in. Following that car, the two bought a chassis from Tri-City Buggy, which they equipped with a new motor. Scott would eventually wreck that car at Manzanita Speedway, and at that point, his dad was done financing the racing, and if Scott wanted to continue, it would be on his money. Scott would then go on to build his well-known white wedge car. At the age of 18, Scott made the decision to leave California and move to Mooresburg, Tennessee, where his dad had bought some property. We are over Mooresburg, Tennessee, which is a small, unincorporated community in Hawkins County, located in the northeastern part of the state. It's nestled near Cherokee Lake, also known as Cherokee Reservoir, and is surrounded by the Appalachian foothills. Mooresburg has a rural charm with a rich historical background. The community's history dates back to the 18th century when settlers began moving into the area. It is named after Major Hugh Moore, a prominent figure in the early development of the region. And of course, in more recent decades, Mooresburg became known in the motorsports world as the home of Scott Bloomquist. Scott worked clearing trees on that property in Tennessee for $250 a week, and he lived in an apartment inside a hangar on the property. After Scott started winning races at the nearby Kingsport Speedway in Tennessee for $2,500 a week, his days of cutting trees on the property came to an end. Kingsport Speedway, often referred to as the Concrete Jungle now, is a historic short track located in Kingsport, Tennessee. The Speedway has been a centerpiece of regional stock car racing since it opened in 1965 as a high-banked dirt track. It later was converted to asphalt and eventually back to dirt and then to concrete. Scott's breakthrough came in 1988 at the World 100 at Eldora Speedway, a prestigious event in the dirt late model racing circuit. This victory not only put him on the map, but also solidified his reputation as a force to be reckoned with. It didn't take long for him to start racking up wins. Fans quickly took notice of his unconventional style, both on and off the track. Scott wasn't just a racer, he was a showman. He understood the importance of the spectacle. Whether it was his dramatic post-race interviews or his flair for intimidating rivals with a calm, almost cocky demeanor. By the 1990s, his mastery of car setups became stuff of legend. Scott wasn't just driving cars, he was reinventing how they were built and handled. His attention to detail was meticulous, bordering on obsessive. He became known for spending countless hours tweaking and adjusting his cars until they were perfect. We are approaching the farm and home of Scott, as well as his motorsports business, Bloomquist Racing. It's about 140 acres. Here you'll find his home, his parents' home, a couple of sport shop businesses, the airstrip where he flew his plane from, and also the barn that he crashed into that day. This is also the property where Scott claims to have been abducted by aliens for a few days, but that's a whole other story. It was an accident at Kingsport that sent Scott on the journey of precise car setups. During one race, Scott had collided with two other cars that had wrecked, hitting his right rear fender. After the incident, Scott had believed that there was no damage to his car. He did, however, notice that following races, he didn't do as well. He was now coming in a distant second. When he investigated it, he realized that the rear end of his car was slightly bent, giving the tires a toe-out alignment. While correcting that, Scott thought, well, maybe I can try adjusting this in various ways to see what works the best. That thought process was then applied to frame stiffness, shocks, and many other aspects of the car. And it wasn't long before he began to dominate the sport, not just winning races, but championships. Scott claimed his first dirt racing major title in 1994 when he won the Tampa Dirt Racing Series Championship. This victory solidified his status as one of the top drivers in the sport. He would also win this race in 1995, 1998, and 2000. Over the years, he would go on to win dozens of prestigious events. His career would ultimately tally more than 600 featured wins, a staggering number by any standard. And of course, you can't talk about Scott Bloomquist without addressing the controversies that have followed him like a shadow. Scott has always been a polarizing figure, both adored and reviled by fans and competitors alike. His unapologetic attitude and willingness to bend or outright break the rules have earned him both admiration and criticism. We will exit the helicopter here where the accident occurred. Here in the simulator, we may not have an accurate depiction of the area, but the following images will help illustrate the area we are walking in. The crash occurred on the airstrip on Scott's property. It appears to be about 1,100 feet from the hangar to where there's some fences that would allow them to land. From the hangars, going down this runway, to the left is where the barn is. The barn is known as the Pan Am barn because of the large Pan Am sign that's on the front of it, and it's on the left about 900 feet down the runway. Now this crash occurred while Scott was either taking off or landing, it's still not known. But he veered off to the left, and unfortunately that left turn put him right into the barn. He could have missed the barn to the left or the right, and that would have given him more distance, and maybe he would have been able to stop the aircraft. When the plane impacted the barn, it stayed intact, but a fire broke out that engulfed the cockpit. Scott said that he only ever flew the plane from this runway and back to this runway. Most of the time he was taking the plane up to fly over the lake that's adjacent to his property so that he could scout for good fishing spots. He claimed once he found a good fishing spot where the fish were running that he could see while flying over the lake, he would return to the airstrip and then go get his boat. The weather at the time of the crash was reported as few clouds at 4,500 feet and no winds. Emergency responders from the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office and local fire departments arrived promptly, but unfortunately were unable to save Scott. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an investigation into the crash. As of now, its preliminary report is still labeled as pending, and the exact cause of the accident remains unknown. Some people have speculated about why the aircraft lost steering and veered off the runway. It could have been a loss of a rudder cable, loss of a brake, loss of a tail wheel spring, or even a medical condition with the pilot, which can all lead to loss of directional control, but we may never know. As we head to our destination, I would ask that you reach down and hit that subscribe button. And it lets YouTube as well as myself know that you like the videos and I should continue making them. I appreciate it. Scott developed a passion for aviation early in his life, inspired by his father, who was a professional pilot. He began flying under his father's guidance and soloed at the age of 16. Although he did attempt to obtain a pilot's certificate, he didn't succeed, and he chose not to pursue formal licensing further. Despite this, he continued to fly throughout his life. Scott owned several vintage aircraft along with his dad, and one notable one was this 1938 Piper. His father was a professional pilot, and he also builds and rebuilds World War I aircraft and flies them from the same airstrip here on the family farm. The Piper Cub is one of the most iconic and beloved light aircrafts in aviation history. Introduced in the late 1930s by the Piper Aircraft Company, the J3 Cub quickly gained a reputation for its simplicity, reliability, and affordability. This two-seat tandem monoplane became a popular choice for flight training, personal flying, and utility purposes. During World War II, there was a militarized version of the aircraft known as the L-4 Grasshopper that was used for reconnaissance and sometimes medical evacuation. According to the Federal Aviation Administration's records, the aircraft had not been licensed since 2012. Additionally, the reports mentioned that Scott did not possess a valid pilot's license at the time of the crash. Well, let's get the helicopter back on the ground where we started today's tour. So from suspension setups to tire management, Scott has been at the forefront of technological advancements in the sport. Many of the techniques and strategies he pioneered have now become standard practice among his peers. His custom-built race cars, often referred to simply as Bloomquist chassis, are a testament to his ingenuity. These cars have been driven to victory by countless racers, further cementing his legacy as not just a driver but a revolutionary figure in the sport. As the years rolled on, most of Scott's contemporaries began to fade from the spotlight. But not Scott. Even as he entered his 50s and 60s, he continued to compete at the highest level of the sport, defying the odds and limitations of age. While injuries and health issues have occasionally sidelined him in recent years, Scott's passion for racing remained undiminished. Scott is survived by his former wife, Katrina Bloomquist, his only child, a daughter, Ariel Bloomquist, his parents, Ron and Georgie Bloomquist, and his sister, Shelley Bloomquist. That was a little bit about Scott Bloomquist and the tragic plane crash that took his life. And we will see you on the next tour.